Get started. Thank you everyone for joining another session of our Moral Narratives Workshop. Really excited today to have our two speakers from philosophy and psychology addressing issues at the intersection of testimony, criminal justice, and victim narratives. So first up, we're going to have Dr. Jennifer Lackey, who is the Wayne and Elizabeth Jones Professor of Philosophy at Northwestern University. She's also the founding director of the Northwestern Prison Education Program, professor of law as courtesy, and past president of the Central Division of the American Philosophical Association. Most of her research is in the area of social epistemology with a focus on the intersection of epistemology and the US criminal legal system. And then we'll transition to our second speaker, Dr. Jillian Jordan, who is an associate professor of business administration in the Negotiation, Organizations, and Markets Unit at Harvard Business School. So her research investigates moral behavior and the psychology that surrounds it, with a focus on the role of reputation. So her work is really interdisciplinary as well and integrates methods from psychology, behavioral economics, and evolutionary game theory. So we're, all right, so I'm just gonna hand it off right away to Jillian. No, not Jill, sorry, Jennifer.
Thanks so much. Okay, so hold on. My screen is kind of damaged, so I'm having a little bit of trouble, but I think, okay. Can everybody see everything okay? Yes, and you can hear me. Okay, I'm gonna, because I'm working off of a small screen, I'm not gonna be able to see any of you. So if you need to get my attention, I'm gonna try to keep an eye on the time, but if you need to get my attention, please just unmute yourself and call my name because I can't see you. Okay, so hold on. Why is this? Okay, so I have a ton of things I want to go over today. I'm going to try to get through as much of it as I can. So I'm really interested right now in, I guess, just very broadly speaking, the epistemic significance of talking and listening, of people telling their stories and of people listening to people's stories, particularly after gross violations and injustices. So that's kind of the context of what I'm going to be looking at today, talking, listening, and what I call epistemic reparations. So the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 1995 to investigate human rights violations that took place under apartheid. And the mandate of the commission was to investigate and record gross abuses of human rights between 1960 and 1994, to offer reparation and rehabilitation to victims, and controversially, when appropriate, to grant amnesty to perpetrators. And one of the victims who came to testify at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was Lucas Baba Sikwapere. And he recounted having been shot multiple times by an apartheid-era police officer, which led to multiple bullets being lodged in his neck and face that caused blindness and severe headaches. And when the commissioner asked him, "How do you feel, Baba, about coming here to tell your story?" Sikwapere responded, "I feel what has been making me sick all the time is the fact that I couldn't tell my story. But now it feels like I got my sight back by coming here and telling you the story." Now, of course, Sikwapere did not literally regain his sight by testifying to the TRC. Instead, he's communicating that something powerful or transformative occurred through the act of telling his story. But notice telling is here being understood not only as distinctively interpersonal, but also as a success term. It's clear that Sikwapere would not have had the experience he had if he told his story with no listener or if the audience members ignored him. He didn't want to just utter words into the void. He needed to be listened to and heard by other people. Otherwise put, Sikwapere needed, and this is a phrase that I'm going to be coming back to for reasons that will be clear, to be known in order to feel like he got his sight back. Now, this isn't unique to paradigmatic cases of human rights violations. Louis Jim Fogel served 34 years for the 1976 murder and rape of a 15-year-old girl in Pennsylvania, Deanne Catherine Long. And his conviction was based largely on the testimony, clearly unreliable, of a jailhouse informant. In 2014, DNA testing excluded Fogel as the contributor of the male DNA that was found at the scene. And he was interviewed by the Innocence Project in 2015. And despite the fact that he was released from prison and exonerated, he repeatedly came back in his interview to something else that was extremely important to him. And he said, I want people to know the truth about my case. Knowing the truth about his case is to know the truth about him, that he didn't take the life of Long and is thus not a murderer and a rapist. In other words, even after the external injustices of incarceration and wrongful conviction were reversed, there was something else, another desire that Fogel had, and that was, again, I'm going to use this phrase, to be known. Now, it's clear that being listened to can be very important for instrumental purposes, but what I want to flag here is that being listened to is not instrumental in these cases. Rather, it's regarded as an end in itself. Obviously, we want to hear people report gross violations and injustices as a means to, preventing them from occurring in the future, or to educate the public about atrocities and so on. But in these cases, the victims in question are highlighting the need or desire to be known as independent from these other downstream aims. So what I want to do today is to provide a discussion of the epistemic significance of what I'm calling being known, and the relationship it has to storytelling and reparations that are distinctively epistemic. I'm going to draw on and expand a framework that's provided by the United Nations of the right to know. And I'm going to use this framework to show that victims of gross violations and injustices also have the right to be known, to be givers of knowledge to others about their own experiences. This is the storytelling element, to be in a position to be able to tell their story. I'm going to show how such victims can suffer epistemic wrongs by being rendered invisible, vilified, or demonized, or systematically distorted, so that the public narratives have this, in that these ways of not being known through these false narratives demand epistemic reparations. And I'm going to conclude by exploring the power of storytelling as a form of epistemic reparation, with a particular emphasis on the role of narrative within the criminal legal system. So in 1997, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights issued a report that addressed the impunity of perpetrators of civil and political human rights violations. And they highlighted 3 principles for the protection and promotion of human rights through action that combats impunity: the right to know, the right to justice, and the right to reparation. I'm going to focus for our purposes today on the right to know, which they characterized as not simply the right of any individual victim or his nearest and dearest to know what happened, a right to the truth. The right to know is also a collective right, drawing upon history to prevent violations from occurring in the future. And the knowledge in question in the UN report involves the occurrence, causes, circumstances, and perpetrators of gross human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law. And the bearers of these rights are victims, their families, their communities, society, or a people. Now, in 2005, the UN updated the principles to further flesh out how they understand this right to know. And they said that victims and their families have the imprescriptible right to know the truth about the circumstances in which violations took place, and in the event of death or disappearance, the victim's fate. And they regard it as an inalienable right of every people to know about the perpetration and circumstances surrounding heinous crimes. So these 2 aspects of the report concern rights bearers and the nature of the rights, but they also flesh out the corresponding duties of the states or governments in question. So the state has the duty to make knowable, and this involves the duty, for instance, to preserve memory, which involves the preservation of archives and other evidence concerning violations of human rights and humanitarian law, and the facilitation of knowledge of these violations, including protecting the collective memory from extinction and guarding against the development of revisionist and negationist views. So there are 4 features that emerge from the UN framework that I want to highlight. Possessing certain kinds of knowledge is a right that belongs to individuals and communities. There can be a right to something that's distinctively epistemic in nature. The right in question here is an inalienable natural right, one that is not dependent on law, culture, or government and can't be repealed. And the right is connected to gross violations and injustices, often perpetrated by states, governments, or groups. But one of the things I want to highlight today is that the framework provided by the UN is powerful not only for what it includes, but also for what it leaves out. So absent from this picture, I want to suggest is another dimension of rights and duties that is arguably just as significant as those highlighted in the UN report. And that's the right to be known and the corresponding duty to see, hear, or bear witness, what I'm saying to know. So here are just some contrasts just to kind of get a feel for the distinction. The right to know involves a knower and a proposition or propositions, and so it need not be interpersonal. It can, for instance, and often is fulfilled by making available, even through video footage and personally captured, certain facts or truths. So you can imagine the state of Illinois kind of responding to, police violence, not through any official actually speaking to a victim or the victim's family, but just by releasing the body cam from the officer in question. And that would be making knowable what happened. But in contrast, the right to be known is an overtly interpersonal phenomenon. Given that it doesn't make sense to be known by an impersonal object, being known requires at least two persons at the most fundamental level, the knower and the one being known. The right to know has the corresponding duty to tell. So since people have a right to know about gross human rights violations, the state has a responsibility to do things to enable the creation, preservation, and transmission of knowledge. So there's no implicature here of there being, here there is the implicature of at least partial ignorance on the part of those most harms. So victims and their families, for instance, have a right to know about gross human rights violations. So the state has the duty to investigate, remember, and archive so as to uncover and make available what really happened and who was involved. But the right to be known, in contrast, has the corresponding duty to hear or know. It's not just that people have a right to know what happened to victims in certain contexts. It's also that these victims themselves have a right to be seen and heard, to have their stories be given proper uptake. There's no implicature here of ignorance on the part of the victim. They don't need to be given access to truths or facts. Instead, they need to be able to be givers of knowledge, and this requires the listening of others. Now, of course, when the UN talks about the right to know, there's a sense in which listening to victims and their families is included. We can't know all of the details of what really happened regarding human rights violations without the testimony of those most impacted by the crimes. But listening to the victims is only one way to fulfill the rights of those who are ignorant. But on the view that I'm suggesting here, hearing the testimony of victims is an end itself. So I want to suggest that the UN's framework for understanding the right to know can and should be crucially expanded to include the right to be known. So let's take a closer look at the case of Fogel. Not only was he convicted of murder and incarcerated for decades, he was also denied a voice in the epistemic community. He was doubted, silenced, and forbidden from playing a credible role in his own defense. Because of this, he wasn't heard or listened to, and he was thus not seen for who he is. Instead, he was falsely believed to be a liar, a rapist, and a murderer. The community both failed to know who he was and believed him to be something altogether different, someone who is a pariah in the community and is alien to Fogel himself. Justice for Fogel involves not only release from prison, exoneration, and financial compensation, but also repairing his fractured relationship within the epistemic community. We need to hear him, believe him, and see him for who he truly is, not as the person presented to us by the state. We need, that is, to know him, the phrase that I've been using. Now, reparations are intentionally reparative actions in the form of goods given to those wronged by parties who acknowledge responsibility for wrongs and whose reparative actions are intended to redress them. Martha Minow invokes the ideal of restorative justice to understand reparations, saying that the goal of reparations is to repair injustice or to make up for it and to implement future changes to correct the injustice. Now, reparations are offered to individuals and to collectives or communities who have been wronged, and they're either material or symbolic. The aims of reparations are generally regarded as falling into, one of three categories: legal and political, which include the restoration of citizenship and liberty, the reinstatement of jobs and benefits, the restitution of property, and ensuring public status and recognition. The psychosocial, which includes relieving suffering, distress, anger, powerlessness, and the sense of violation experienced by victims and their family members. and the moral, which includes recognizing and restoring the dignity of victims and reaffirming or reestablishing the moral order of a community. But I want to suggest that there's a crucial dimension that's missing from all of the discussions of reparations, and that's the epistemic. We can be wronged not only legally and politically, psychologically and morally, but also epistemically. We're members of an epistemic community in addition to a legal, political, and moral community. We are not just agents in a political and moral sense, but also in an epistemic one. And we have epistemic duties that are distinct from our other ones. Now, what I want to highlight here, and this is not the original work of the project, I want to be really clear that there's an enormous body of literature on epistemic wrongs and epistemic injustices that is kind of very, very rich and fertile. And so here I just kind of want to flag so that you have a better sense of the project, 3 ways that someone might be known, this is not exhaustive, that results in a distinctively epistemic wrong that calls for what I'm calling epistemic reparations. So invisibility, vilification, and demonization, and systematic distortion, all of which I think are directly related to kind of the public narrative that is embraced by people about someone, and which call for epistemic reparations that replace that kind of, for instance, vilified narrative with a complete one. So invisibility, if I don't have any relevant beliefs about you because you are invisible to me, especially as a person, then ipso facto, I don't know you. So the narrator in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man says that white people refuse to see me. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination, indeed everything and anything except me. In the written version of this work, I go into this in a lot more detail, but I'm going to go through this super quickly. So vilification and demonization. So this involves replacing the image of a person with an inaccurate and vilified or demonized version. So with Fogel, it's not that he was invisible to investigators, prosecutors, and the judge or jury, but that he was regarded as a liar and thus as a murderer and rapist of a child. And this sort of epistemic harm is widespread in the United States, where Black Americans are systematically represented and treated as criminals. There's a huge body of literature on this. And so they are not invisible at all, for it's not that they are erased from consciousness, but massively overrepresented in inaccurate and vilified ways. And so the criminalization of Black Americans, both in representation and in over-policing and over-incarceration, is not only a political and moral matter, but also an epistemic one. And then systematic distortion. I think Audre Lorde's discussion of the struggle that Black women face in public narratives is super powerful and beautiful here. She says, it's not that we haven't always been here since there was a here. It's that the letters of our names have been scrambled when they were not totally erased, and our fingerprints upon the handles of history have been called the random brushing of birds. So Black women's experiences are often misunderstood, their identities are misrepresented, and their contributions are misattributed. So one of the reasons we should care about, kind of how we are seen by others, these narratives, these stories that people have about us, is because how we are seen by others will very likely have an impact on who we in fact become. I'm going to skip some of these slides, but I'm happy to talk about this later. So there's, there was this looking glass theory of the self that, kind of said that our conception of self is formed as a reflection of the responses and evaluations of others in our environment. And W.E.B. Du Bois was writing around the same time and talked about, kind of this double consciousness, which of course, he's not discussing a universal or equally shared experience the way that Cooley is, but he's talking about how the racist and unjust structure of the United States forces Black Americans to see themselves through the eyes of others in a way that it does not for white Americans. James Baldwin really, I think, powerfully captures how the benefits of being seen by others and the burden of doing the seeing is not equally distributed. So he says, I've spent most of my life, after all, watching white people and outwitting them so that I can survive. So there are 3 points that we see, and again, I developed this a lot more. This is just super quick here, but ourselves are powerfully shaped by how we think we are seen by others. And so interpersonal relations are fundamental to our identities. Being seen or known is not an equally distributed good. Those with less power are often seen or known far less than those with more. And the labor involved in doing the seeing and knowing is not equally shared among members of our communities. But even if we don't accept the looking glass self-theory in its entirety, regarding ourselves as invisible, demonized, or systematically distorted by other members of our community will very likely have a metaphysical impact on who we in fact become. Hilda Linneman talks really powerfully about this notion of holding. She says we are initiated into personhood through interactions with other persons, and we simultaneously develop and maintain personal identities through interactions with others who hold us in our identities. This holding can be done well or badly. Done well, it supports an individual in the creation and maintenance of a personal identity that allows her to flourish personally and in her interactions with others. Done badly, we hold people in invidious, destructive narratives. Some such narratives identify the social group to which someone belongs as socially and morally inferior. And in that way, the stories uphold abusive power relations between us and them. So there are at least two reasons why the right to know and the duty to hear or know and the wrongs that result from the failure to fulfill this right all include distinctively epistemic dimensions. So the good in question is knowledge, and the right to be known is the right for an epistemic good. And the epistemic also plays a role in terms of the right and the duty to know. So being invisible in whole or in part, vilified or demonized, or being systematically distorted erases or banishes people from the epistemic community. They're denied the status of epistemic personhood. They're prevented from fully exercising their agency. They cannot engage in the giving and receiving of knowledge, including about their own identities, and they can't enter into trusting relationships. So in cases of gross violations or injustices that involve not being known due to one of these three reasons, which is not exhaustive, I want to suggest that distinctively epistemic reparations are needed. So on my view, reparations are epistemic when the goods and the wrongs in question are epistemic. More precisely, I characterize epistemic reparations as intentionally reparative actions in the form of epistemic goods given to those epistemically wronged by parties who acknowledge these wrongs and whose reparative actions are intended to redress them. Now, there are traditional epistemic reparations that are epistemic in nature. They are not called this, but I want to flag this. I think there are three general categories that fall under this: public apologies, memorialization, and education. This is a case that's very close to my heart since I work with a lot of John Birch torture victims, and this took place in Chicago, which is where I'm from and which is where I currently live. So between 1972 and 1991, over 120 people, predominantly Black, were tortured under the command of notorious Chicago Police Department Commander John Birch. And in May of 2015, Chicago became the first city in the United States to provide reparations for racially motivated police violence when the Chicago City Council unanimously passed the reparations ordinance. Now, the ordinance includes so many different kinds, symbolic and material and so on. But what I want to do is just flag the distinctively epistemic reparations in that ordinance. So it required a formal apology from the mayor and city council of Chicago for the torture inflicted on victims, a permanent public memorial that acknowledged the torture, which has not even been started, and the inclusion of a lesson on the Birch torture cases in the Chicago public schools in the 8th and 10th grade US history curriculum. I want to suggest that it's crucial that we acknowledge the distinctively epistemic dimensions of these traditional reparations, the kinds I just discussed. Victims and their communities need to be made whole, not just materially, legally, politically, psychologically, and morally, but epistemically as well. They need the wrongs to be acknowledged. They need to be told the truth. They need to know what happened. They need to have an accurate history documented and remembered, not only for themselves, but for future generations. But I want to also suggest that the right to be known is a prior and just as important epistemic reparation. Before we can properly acknowledge and apologize, memorialize and educate, we need to listen and bear witness. We need to know victims not as merely a means to the end of fulfilling the rights of others to know, but as the end in itself. I know I'm running low on time. Yeah.
5-minute warning. You have 5 minutes.
Oh, I do. Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, well then I think I can finish up. So in some of my very recent work for my project on epistemic reparations, I've been really looking at some of the epistemically generative features of the talking and listening relationship. I've been looking at a lot of like restorative justice material and so on. But what I want to do here is just kind of flag how talking and listening on that kind of storytelling sort of context, that space, can itself be epistemically generative. Obviously, it can be powerfully morally generative as well. But today I just want to talk about how it can be epistemically generative. So in a well-known article from the German playwright Heinrich von Kleist, he wrote, "If there is something you want to know and you cannot discover by meditation, I advise you to discuss it with the first acquaintance whom you happen to meet. The French say appetite comes with eating, and this maxim holds true when parodied into ideas come in speaking." So his view that talking can itself be generative of knowledge has received a significant amount of attention in lots of different contexts. So I'm only going to flag a little bit today. So for instance, there's wide agreement within some of the kind of pedagogical communities that there is a close relationship between talking and thinking, which in turn has given rise to a broad range of research and educational models, standardly called dialogue intensive or talk intensive pedagogies. The core idea is just that successful teaching and learning involves students actively participating in classroom discourse. Otherwise put, talking facilitates knowing. There is also kind of an understanding of our own experience that is not static. And so, I mean, our understanding of our own experience is not static, and so neither is their reality. And this can really be borne out in the kinds of contexts of talking and listening that I'm mostly interested in. So for instance, an event that you regarded as ordinary when it happened may become life-changing or traumatizing or terrifying as you process it through talking and listening with others. You may, for instance, have not even had the concept of despondency when you were 9, but looking back on how you felt after the loss of a loved one at that age, you might be able to understand your younger self as being despondent. Even in the present tense, as you're talking, emotional nuances can shift from moment to moment. You can imagine someone talking about such a loss for the first time as follows: "I felt sad when my mother died when I was 9. No, actually, that doesn't seem quite right. I was utterly despondent, and it was precisely this despondency that now set me on the path that I now see set me on the path toward incarceration." This epistemically generative character of talking and listening can go in both directions. So from this, A Knock on the Door, The Essential History of Residential Schools by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. This is a quote: "For non-Aboriginal Canadians who came to bear witness to survivors' life stories, the experience was powerful. One woman said simply, 'By listening to your story, my story can change. By listening to your story, I can change.'" And so we see the epistemically generative nature of the talking and listening going in both directions. Also, I think this is really important to highlight the power of storytelling. So when agents are invited to speak for themselves, they are often in a position to tell a more comprehensive account of their experiences than would be conveyed by someone else, leading to a deeper understanding on the part of the hearer. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but there's all sorts of work on the power of storytelling and narrative. So basically, I just kind of want to suggest that when we listen to other people's testimony firsthand about their experiences, they're able to fill in explanatory gaps that would otherwise be unavailable. So I think a really powerful example of this is I was participating in a conference on false confessions, and one of the panelists had falsely confessed to a murder he didn't commit. And when he was telling the story, he said that as the interrogator had grabbed his arm and like started tapping on his vein and saying, "This is where the needle's going to go when we execute you, because we're going to go for the death penalty." And he said at that moment, he pictured his mother being behind the glass of his execution, and he just couldn't bear it. And he said, I confessed to something that I didn't do. And so that kind of crucial element of the narrative is so many people say, how do these people falsely confess to murders that they didn't commit? And listening to his story provides a powerful lens through which we can see that. Then I just talk about the role of narrative and storytelling in the criminal legal system. I'm going to skip this. We can talk about this, but there's all sorts of literature on how powerful the role of storytelling and narrative is in the criminal legal system. Okay.
Yeah, we're at time, so if you could wrap up, that'd be great. Oh, great.
Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you.
Okay, so when Sigma Perry and Fogel expressed a desire to be known, and when those who are protesting the systemic racism of policing in America cry out to say their names, it's crucial that we see the true normative force at work here. These aren't expressions of mere personal preferences or demands to simply utter words, but powerful and legitimate epistemic claims that are being made by or on behalf of those who have suffered serious wrongs. I provided some first steps for understanding the nature of these claims. Those who suffer these wrongs have the epistemic right to be known, and we in turn owe epistemic reparations, the fundamental of which is to know them. It's only by listening and bearing witness, by saying their names, that we can truly begin to repair the epistemic damage done to victims in our communities who've been harmed the most. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Jill, if you want to start sharing your screen. And we'll take questions for both speakers at the very end, so please hold your, but feel free to also put them in the chat for Jennifer if you want. All right, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. So I think these two talks pair really nicely together. Today I'm going to be discussing the ways that we perceive victims of wrongdoing when they share their narratives, or when we hear narratives about them that others share. And so this is joint work with Miriam Kochaki at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern. And the work was published last year. And so I'll talk about some of the studies today, but if you're interested in more detail, the paper is out. And so Jennifer gave us lots of compelling examples of this idea that we ubiquitously encounter narratives about immoral acts and their victims. I think an interesting feature of this observation is that sometimes the narratives seem really clearly justified. So lots of the examples in Jennifer's talk, I think, would fall into that category. In other cases, people may be claiming to be victims, and this might not be something that we all agree with. So this is just an example from Trump announcing his candidacy 2 days ago. He said, "I'm a victim. I will tell you I'm a victim." Sort of a common narrative that Trump has put forward over the years that may not sort of universally be seen as accurate by everybody, but it's interesting to think about the consequences of these narratives. And so in particular, I'm interested in how narratives about victims change how moral they seem to us. So how do we evaluate the moral character of victims, and therefore what are the sort of consequences for somebody's moral reputation if we see them as a victim relative to not seeing them as a victim. And so I'm going to talk about a bunch of experiments that we did online using Amazon Mechanical Turk to get at this question. And they share the same basic method. And the method is that we have people read narratives or vignettes that we wrote about an individual who takes a set of actions, and those actions make it so they could become a victim. And then in our victim conditions, somebody mistreats them, so they actually do become a victim. In our neutral conditions, nobody mistreats them and they don't become a victim. So this is just a simple example of one of these vignettes. There are 2 paragraphs. The neutral condition just featured the first paragraph, the victim condition featured both of the paragraphs. So in the first paragraph, you learn about our protagonist named Sam, who's a college student. And last week, he and some of his classmates were studying for an upcoming exam together in his dorm room. And at one point, one of his classmates, Gordon, used his iPad to look something up. Later that day, Sam relaxed by watching a TV show on his iPad, and then he went out for the evening. So in the neutral condition, this is all you learn about Sam. In the victim condition, you also learn that while Sam was out, Gordon entered his dorm room and stole his iPad, and he was upset by this. So he sort of behaved identically in both cases, but in the victim condition, he becomes a victim. And then we ask people to evaluate Sam's moral character. And in particular, we have them answer 2 questions about Sam: how moral of a person is he, and how trustworthy of a person is he? And these 2 items tend to show the same patterns. So in my charts that I'll show you, I'll be showing averages of these 2 items. They sort of hang together as a measure of perceived moral character. So what we did is we used this basic design to investigate perceptions of victims' moral character, and we used a variety of different transgressions that could make people victims in different ways. So we had theft victims, somebody whose iPad was stolen, like I just showed you, also someone whose idea was stolen by their manager at work. We had a case where a corrupt doctor suggested to their patient that they take a drug that the doctor knew would cause bad side effects, but the doctor had a relationship with the drug company that led them to recommend this drug, and then the patient suffered from the bad side effects in the victim condition. We had a scenario where someone was verbally attacked in an unmerited way. Then we had two scenarios sort of in the domain of sexual transgressions. One that I'm referring to here as sexual aggression, that was somewhat vague as to what actually happened, and then a case that unambiguously described rape. And what we found is that the sort of consistent pattern was that people tended to see victims as more morally virtuous than non-victims who had behaved identically. And this was pretty consistent across the different transgressions that we looked at. So it came out for every case except this vaguer sexual aggression scenario. And so we refer to this finding as the virtuous victim effect, whereby people perceive victims of wrongdoing as more morally good than non-victims who have behaved identically. And so for the rest of the talk, I just want to sort of share some of the work we did to try to understand why this is happening, what causes this virtuous victim effect. And what the data ultimately supported was a suggestion that I'm going to refer to as the justice restoration hypothesis, which is basically that we see victims as virtuous because it has a motivational function to hold this perception. That when we see victims as virtuous, this motivates us to help them, and it also motivates us to punish the perpetrators who have wronged them. And we argue this is like generally a good motivation to have when you encounter injustice, because we typically face sort of social incentives that lead us to be rewarded for engaging in these justice restorative actions. So it's sort of typically in line with our self-interest to actually help victims and to punish perpetrators. And as a result, it's a good thing to feel motivated to do that. And I could talk more about the different ways we can be rewarded for these justice restorative actions. I think there's a lot of scholarship on this that sort of was background for this project rather than being a part of this project. So in some of my work, for example, I've been interested in how punishing perpetrators can improve our reputation. This could be one reason. It could sort of be in our self-interest to feel motivated to punish perpetrators, is that if we do so, it can make us look good in the eyes of others. So there's sort of lots of reasons it may be a good idea to engage in these justice restorative actions. And our suggestion is that as a result, it's sort of beneficial to see victims as virtuous because it motivates these justice restorative actions. I also want to just sort of explicitly raise some alternative explanations for why we might see victims as virtuous that we sort of tested and found evidence against. So one is a contrast effect. You might imagine that victims look good because we're evaluating their character in contrast to these morally bad perpetrators who have wronged them, and so they seem good in comparison. Another idea is this is sort of a simple sympathy effect where we basically feel bad for people who have suffered, and so we want to say nice things about them. So we rate the victims as morally good because we feel bad for them. And then finally, you might imagine people genuinely hold the belief that individuals who become victims sort of on average tend to be people who behave morally. So maybe people really truly think there's an association statistically in the world between becoming a victim and being a good person. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of provide some evidence in favor for the justice restorative hypothesis, and then talk about some ways we sort of also found evidence against some of these alternatives. So to evaluate the justice restorative hypothesis or justice restoration hypothesis, we wanted to ask two basic questions. The first is it actually true that seeing a victim as virtuous does motivate us to want to help victims and punish perpetrators, to take these justice restorative actions? And then second, if this is true, is this actually why we see victims as virtuous? So starting with this first question, like, does seeing a victim as virtuous in fact motivate us to help them and punish the perpetrator that harmed them? To test this, we did an experiment where we manipulated the morality of a target character named Sarah. So we had two conditions. In one condition, we described Sarah as sort of a really good person. She's not self-centered. She's supportive of her friends and family. She volunteers her time and donates her money. She's this great person. In our control condition, she seemed relatively less moral, so more self-centered, less supportive, less likely to be altruistic in these ways. And then in this experiment, we weren't manipulating if the target was a victim. They were always a victim. So we told everybody in all conditions that Sarah was victimized, in particular that her boss stole her idea and took credit for it. And then finally, we measured subjects' willingness to help Sarah and punish the perpetrator. And what we found is that basically, when we describe Sarah as a really great person, people are much, much more motivated to help her following her becoming a victim. And they're also significantly more motivated to punish her perpetrator, her boss who stole her idea, for the exact same transgression. So this shows that sort of a motivational consequence of Sarah being a good person is that we feel more inclined to help her and to punish the person who harmed her. So this sort of provides evidence for this idea that, yes, seeing a victim as virtuous really does have this consequence motivationally of leading us to want to help them and punish the person who wronged them. And then the question is, like, is this actually why people see victims as virtuous? Is this the function or the explanation for this virtuous victim effect? So to test this hypothesis, what we did is we said, well, a prediction of this idea is that if the reason we see victims as virtuous is to motivate us to engage in justice restorative action, this virtuous victim effect should go away in cases where it's not actually in our self-interest to engage in these justice restorative actions. So I said a little bit ago that I think typically it sort of is in our self-interest to help victims and to punish perpetrators, but there are surely situations where that's not true for whatever reason. And if we create one of these situations by introducing disincentives for these justice restorative actions, our theory should suggest that the virtuous victim effect should go away because it's no longer useful motivationally to feel inclined to help the victim and to punish the perpetrator. So to test this, we designed an experiment where we could introduce disincentives for justice restorative action and ask, does this turn off this virtuous victim effect? So to do this, what we did is we asked participants to imagine that they worked at an ad agency where there was the potential for ideas to be stolen by people. People sort of brainstorm ideas in teams, but they get promoted or fired based on the quality of their individual work. And so this creates the potential for people to sort of take undue credit for somebody else's idea. And then we asked subjects to imagine a sort of more specific scenario that sort of created incentives or disincentives to react to instances of idea theft with these justice restorative actions of helping the victim or punishing the perpetrator. So in the incentives condition, we told subjects, you think idea theft is a major problem in this workplace environment that you're in, and you've publicly rallied against it. You've talked about how you think it's a really big issue, and you've talked about how we need to sort of change the system to make it less easy for people to steal each other's ideas. And so in this scenario, if you observe an instance of idea theft and react by helping the victim and punishing the perpetrator, this is sort of in line with your incentives. You're maybe going to change a system that you think is problematically making idea theft possible. You're also going to affirm your public stance and sort of look like you were right that this is a big issue. In the disincentives condition, we told people the opposite. We say, you think that idea theft is unjust, but that it happens really rarely. And so you've actually publicly defended this sort of brainstorming system where people brainstorm in teams that makes idea theft possible because you think this brainstorming system is generally really good. It's a good way to come up with good ideas. And this idea theft thing, yes, it's wrong when it happens, but it's not a big issue. So here, if you witness an instance of idea theft and you punish the perpetrator and help the victim and sort of call attention to the problem, you actually might undermine your goal, right? It might lead to this brainstorming system changing in a way that you actually don't think it should. And it also sort of contradicts your public stance about whether this is a big deal. So you sort of have situation-specific disincentives that actually don't make justice restorative action a great option for you. Then we cross this manipulation of whether or not there are disincentives for justice restorative action with a second manipulation of whether or not Sarah's idea is stolen, right? So this is our same basic method. Sometimes in the neutral condition, Sarah has a good idea, but she's not a victim. No one steals it. In the victim condition, Sarah has a good idea and it gets stolen. And then we measure perceptions of Sarah's moral character to see if this virtuous victim effect is occurring in each of our two incentives conditions. So what I'm going to show you on the y-axis is perceived moral character for Sarah, depending on whether the participant evaluating sort of was in this incentives or disincentives condition, and then also whether or not Sarah became a victim. And what we see is that in the incentives condition, we get the same virtuous victim pattern that we get by default when there's no big preamble about your incentives in the situation. But this effect goes away in the disincentives condition, where people are sort of told, like, idea theft is a problem. It's not that it's not a transgression or that someone whose idea is stolen isn't a victim, but it's sort of not really in your interest to make a big deal out of it when it happens and react by helping the victim or punishing the perpetrator. So this sort of together provides support for this idea that when we see a victim as virtuous, a motivational consequence of that is that we're inclined to help them and to punish the perpetrator who wronged them. And this kind of seems like a good explanation for why we actually see victims as virtuous, because we find that in cases when these justice restorative actions aren't sort of in line with our incentives, people stop actually seeing victims as more virtuous than non-victims. So consistent with that is the idea that we see victims as virtuous in this way in order to motivate these actions, and that these actions are usually in line with our incentives. So now I'm going to talk about some work where we sort of explicitly tried to test these alternative explanations that I mentioned that are not the justice restorative hypothesis, and mention some evidence against them. So the first idea is this contrast effect idea. Maybe we rate victims as moral because we're just thinking about them in contrast to perpetrators. And this makes a simple prediction, which is that if this is what's going on, then anytime you read about a transgression, all other parties should appear more virtuous. It shouldn't be specific to victims. It should be anyone else, because anyone else might sort of stand in contrast to this morally bad perpetrator. So what we did is we considered three conditions: one where no theft occurs, one where a perpetrator named Gabrielle steals from a victim named Sarah, and one where a perpetrator named Gabrielle steals from a victim named Rachel. In all cases, subjects then rate the morality of Sarah. That's what I'm going to show you on the y-axis here. And so in the no theft occurs case, Sarah's not a victim. In the Gabrielle steals from Sarah case, Sarah is a victim. And in the Gabrielle steals from Rachel case, Sarah is not a victim, right? Rachel's the victim, not Sarah, but you could plausibly contrast Sarah with Gabrielle because you learned about a transgression. So if this whole thing was just a contrast effect, the two cases where Gabrielle steals, Sarah should be rated similarly. And that's not what we find. So what we find is that Sarah seems more moral when she's the victim than when Rachel is the victim, suggesting that this virtuous victim bump is sort of extending specifically to victims and not to anybody that could be contrasted with the perpetrator. So this suggests that it's not just this simple contrast effect. We were also interested in the idea, are people just rating the victims as morally virtuous because they feel sorry for them, that something bad happened to them and they want to say nice things about them? So is this sort of the simple sympathy effect? And to get at this question, we wanted to know two things. The first is, does this effect extend to victims of accidental misfortune who have suffered a bad outcome that could make us feel bad for them, but haven't been wronged in a moral sense? So we contrasted a case where Sarah's iPad was stolen by her classmate, a sort of standard victim case, to two accident cases. So one where an earthquake causes Sarah's iPad to fall off a shelf, and one where a stray cat causes her iPad to fall off the shelf. And the earthquake and the cat case, they ended up looking very similar. So I'm gonna show data where we just average these two accidents together. So in both cases, she suffers the same bad outcome that might make you feel bad for her, but she hasn't been morally wronged. We also wanted to ask, does the effect extend to any nice thing that you might say about the victim? Or is it specific to seeing the victim as morally virtuous? So we wanted to ask, does this effect sort of apply to positive traits that are not related to morality? So we contrasted how people rated these different targets on morality and trustworthiness, our two moral traits, but also a set of non-moral traits: how intelligent, how athletic, how sociable, and how funny does the target seem. And so these are good things, but they're not about morality. So what I'm going to show now is, in these three conditions, ratings on the moral traits, which are averaged together, and the positive non-moral traits, which are averaged together, because they all sort of showed similar patterns within categories. So what we see here is basically two things. The first is, if we look at the moral traits, the theft victim in orange is seen as significantly higher than the accident victims or the neutral case. So it seems like this virtuous victim bump on the moral traits is specific to transgressions that are immoral. It's not extending to someone who suffers the same bad outcome but hasn't been treated immorally. And then if we look at the non-moral traits, what we can see is that in both the accident and the victim case, there's this small boost on the non-moral traits, but it's equally large for the accident case and the theft victim case, and it's smaller than the boost the theft victim gets on the moral traits. So there's sort of a specificity to moral traits that's not extending equally to non-moral traits. So together, these results suggest that there's sort of a moral specificity here to this effect. It's preferentially applied to people who are treated immorally by others, and it preferentially extends for victims of theft to perceived morality and not just any positive trait, suggesting that this isn't a really simple story where when something bad happens to you and you suffer a bad outcome, people just want to be nice to you and they rate you positively in all the ways, regardless of whether it was an accident or an intentional transgression. Then finally, we were interested in this idea of, well, maybe people genuinely believe that victims tend to be people who behave more morally. Like, we could have a theory that trusting, naive, nice people tend to be preyed on preferentially. And so if I learn that you became a victim, that's actually like a meaningful statistical indicator that you're a good person. And so the thing that we found that was inconsistent with this was an interesting dissociation, which is that we found that the virtuous victim effect really consistently extended to perceptions of moral character, but not actually concrete predictions about moral behavior. So I'm not going to go into all the details for this short talk, but essentially we found this virtuous victim effect when we measured how moral of a person is the victim, how trustworthy of a person is the victim. When we asked people to predict how is this target character going to behave in concrete situations where they have the opportunity for morally good acts, like volunteering for a cause, donating money to charity, planning a surprise party for someone they know, we found no differences in predictions between victims and non-victims. And similarly, when we asked people to predict how likely is this target character to engage in concrete bad behaviors, like flirting with somebody else while they're in a committed relationship or spreading mean gossip in order to look good, people also saw the victims as just as likely to take these actions as non-victims. So it seemed like there's this sort of sense in which we see victims as moral with respect to their character, but when we're concretely making predictions about how they're going to act, we actually don't think they're more likely to behave morally, suggesting that people aren't holding a genuine belief that victims tend to be the types of people who behave morally. Instead, it seems like this dissociation, this idea that we see victims as good people, but we don't really expect them to behave more morally in concrete situations, seems kind of in line, I think, with this motivational story that the justice restoration hypothesis is telling, where we see victims as good because it motivates us to want to help them and to punish those who have harmed them. But maybe it's not such a good idea to actually concretely expect different actions of them if it's not true on average that victims tend to behave more morally than non-victims. So I think we may be sort of seeing victims as moral in this sense of like they deserve stuff, they deserve support, they deserve us to punish the perpetrators who have wronged them, and not moral in the sense of I should trust them to return money to me if I lend it to them, or I should expect them to be a really reliable collaborator, because perhaps there's not much meaningful information about someone's tendency to behave morally in the fact that they're victimized. So just wrapping up, people tend to see victims of wrongdoing as more moral than non-victims who have behaved identically, which we refer to as the virtuous victim effect. This doesn't seem to be a simple contrast effect where victims look good because we're comparing them to perpetrators. It also seems to be specific in some sense to morality. So it doesn't extend to accidental misfortune in the same way. It doesn't extend to positive traits that are unrelated to morality in the same way. And it also is sort of about perceptions of character in particular and not predictions about moral behavior. And data do seem to support this idea that we see victims as good because this has a motivational function of encouraging us to punish perpetrators and help victims. And these are actions that tend to be aligned with our incentives. And in cases when they're not so aligned with our incentives, we actually don't see people showing this virtuous victim effect. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much for this excellent talk. I think we do actually have time for a couple questions.
Awesome.
Maybe start with Eliana.
Yes, great set of talks. My question is for Jillian. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering, in the experiment that you presented with the justice restoration hypothesis, have you accounted for the possibility that in the disincentives condition, people were just kind of told that, you know, it's not that big of a deal if someone's idea gets stolen. So perhaps like the victims' like legitimacy was undermined, or in any way they were just seen as like complainers or something. And so maybe that's why people were.
Yeah, a couple of things about that are interesting. So one is, we really didn't want to create a situation where people didn't think it was a transgression. So we did try to stress in the actual stimuli, and we showed people in the disincentives condition, like, you agree that when it happens, it's really unjust. It's just that you don't think it happens very often. So the issue is about the frequency with which you think it happens rather than how wrong it is. And we did like a manipulation check study after the fact, where we asked people to rate, in the situation described by these instructions, like, how much would it benefit your self-interest to punish the perpetrator and help the victim? And also, under this viewpoint, how much do you think the person is a victim? And we found basically the disincentives condition had this huge effect of reducing how much people thought it would be in someone's self-interest to punish the perpetrator and help the victim. It did have a marginally significant, like, and pretty small effect on how much they thought the person was a victim, but the absolute ratings of how much the person was a victim were still really high. It was like, the mean was over 8 out of 9, even in the disincentives condition. So I don't think that it erased the perception like this is a transgression. I think we were largely successful in manipulating just like perceptions of incentives. And then but the other thing that I think is interesting about your question is this idea, like, were they just seen as complainers? Which I think raises an interesting question about like first versus third person narrative. So all of this was in third person, so no one was necessarily seen as complaining, because the story was just describing what happened to them, not anything about their response. We did actually find, though, that when we put this stuff in first person, in certain scenarios, but not other scenarios, the virtuous victim effect went away. And in some follow-up work I'm doing, I think I'm finding evidence, right, that people can see it as complaining to share your story when you're a victim, and that it can actually not be great for how moral you seem. And so I think putting together this disincentives idea with this possibility that you can be seen as a complainer, an interesting mechanism through which we might turn off the virtuous victim effect when we have disincentives, I think could be just dismissing the account as complaining, even if objectively there is no reason to think that it wasn't a wrongdoing. But I think this sort of psychology of blaming instead of supporting and seeing them as annoying and complaining, this might be turned on in cases where we have an incentive not to support the victim. So I do think that's a very interesting suggestion. Sorry for the very long answer to that.
No, thank you. That was great. Thanks.
Question from Manisha, and then if we have time, maybe get to Walter's question in the chat as well for Jennifer. Manisha, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for both these talks. Like that, I was really fascinated by them, and in a way, I think this question is kind of building on some of what was just discussed in response to Eliana. But I kept thinking about the kind of conflating of two levels in the talks today, and would be really interested in both your perspectives on that. In that there's a kind of intimate interpersonal context in which it matters deeply to be known and to be heard, and in which we bring all of our knowledge about the characters to bear on evaluating whether the victim is in fact virtuous or not, and whether the perpetrator is in fact immoral or not, versus a sort of more collective level in which you think about memorials and education and things like that. And I just wondered if both of you have thought about those two different levels, and whether the kind of dynamics would be different, whether we need to think about those differently when we think about morality. I mean, there's some tricky stuff about intimate relationships and morality, and like special duties and things like that too. So I guess that's kind of a very ill-formed prompt rather than a question. But I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
Sure. I guess I can offer a few thoughts. So I love the question, actually, and think about it a lot. And I'm going to have like very ill-formed and not satisfying things to say about it. But I came to the project primarily through my just knowing so many real people on the ground who have been wrongfully convicted, and the total sense of invisibility and the screaming into the void, so to speak, that they have felt for decades. And so I came to the project very much thinking about the interpersonal, something I really experience a lot, like the talking and listening in an interpersonal space, and the kind of potential for epistemic reparation that is that we find there. When I started doing like extensive research kind of to build a project on this, it really started to get centered in truth and reconciliation commissions. I was just in South Africa last week doing hosting a conference on epistemic reparations on Constitution Hill with a whole bunch of people who had been victims of apartheid. And, you know, one of the most powerful sentences was, the truth and reconciliation had neither truth nor reconciliation. So a lot of these kind of big spaces to provide stories, you know, to tell our stories and to kind of have some sort of space where reparative work can be done often fail. And so I'm sort of really deeply interested in both the power of the kind of interpersonal, how you and I and everyone in this space can engage in epistemically reparative, you know, kind of actions, but then also what the responsibility are for states and governments and sorry, I have dogs. And thinking through, I also have a colleague that I'm collaborating with in Canada on all the truth and reconciliation work going on in Canada, and thinking about those spaces too. So actually, I'm just like echoing like, that I think there are important differences. I'm doing some work right now to try to explore that. But yeah, I just think it's a great question and something that's going to be really, I think, important for the project I'm working on.
Awesome. I know that it's now past 12, so that was a great answer. I don't think that I need to add anything for now.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks both of the speakers, and thank you everyone. Sorry for going over time a little bit, but we'll see you next time.